Hey there, I'm Jason Little, the founder of Lean Change, and here's an overview of the elements of change. So you can think of these as a periodic table of elements, much like in chemistry, where you'll take elements and combine them to make other things depending on a context. The same thing with the elements of change. Your situation and your change is unique, and one approach that might work in one organization might not work in another. So we've split up these elements into two main buckets: the art of change and the science of change. Within the art of change is self and stance, and within the science of change are big ideas and tools and practices. And here's how they work. So first up are big ideas and meta models. You can think of these as elements related to sense making. They might help you unravel a problem in the organization. They might help you understand a certain dynamic. And then once you believe that this idea or this mental model is going to be the most important thing to focus on for the change, that will lead you into some tools and practices you could potentially use. So for example, if you believe alignment is the problem, a strategic change canvas or a storytelling canvas would be perfect tools to create alignment because they're designed to invoke a meaningful conversation. They're not templates to be filled out. And it's important to make that distinction because you also need to factor in your stance. So by stance, I mean, am I coming into this as a coach, as a mentor, as a trainer? Do I believe I have to get other people to buy into the change, or do I believe my responsibility is helping co-create the change? So in the example of wanting to create more alignment and using a canvas, I may need to adopt, or I should adopt, a co-creation stance because I want to build that canvas with the people affected. I don't want it to be a template that gets filled out by stakeholders and then communicated at people. Finally, the self dimension will help us hopefully understand some of our biases. We all have blind spots, we all have preferences. There's something about our temperament and our personality that helps and influence us towards how we facilitate change. So this dimension can help you with some ideas, such as if you're thinking about alignment, wanting to run a change canvas session, and you want to take a co-creation stance. If you're in a very conservative organization where that approach is completely different from what the cultural norms are, then within the exceptional 8 element within self, one of the properties of that is courage. So you might have to just take yourself out of your comfort zone. But all 4 of these things are interconnected, and the goal is how can we combine these things to figure out what's the best approach I can take right now to nudge the change one small step forward. It's important to talk about some of the pitfalls with these dimensions. Now, because some people, again, they're idea thinkers, some people like tools, some people prefer a coaching stance, we've all got our internal biases, and there's a bit of a danger of only leaning on one dimension. So if I am an idea person and I keep talking about mental models and ideas, that might be confusing for people. It might not make the change feel real because we're always talking about abstract things without context. Now, big ideas and meta models are good to help explain dynamics and situations you might see, but we can't focus too much just on big ideas because, again, it might take people's brains away from the actual change and put them towards trying to understand what the model is instead. Now, it's no secret that change agents love tools and practices. Too much emphasis on that can take the humanity away. So for example, using a change canvas, but thinking that it's a template that has to get filled out, or just using one of our standard out-of-the-box templates. The real magic of change canvases is you architect a session and the canvas just holds the output. So if we continually rely on tools, we'll skew our change towards how the tools actually work as opposed to what might be the right things to do to move the change forward. It's important to talk about stance as well. So one of the pitfalls is if you focus too much on yourself, then you might make the change about you instead of the people affected. So I was in an environment once where I truly believed co-creation is the best way to move change forward. So I came in as a coach and I was using a coaching stance. Turns out what that organization needed was more of a mentor. Go hit that nail with a hammer 4 times and come back to me and tell me what happened. So I needed to adjust my stance to match the context. If you continually get locked in your own stance, you might disconnect from what the actual system of people needs to help move the change forward. Self is very similar to stance, but we all have blind spots. We can only become so aware of our own blind spots, but it's something we should work on. So it's something where maybe we can ask for feedback from people in the organization about, is my stance the right stance for what you all need to move this change forward? Is there something about myself that I can do to be more supportive in the change? But if we rely too much on self, it's kind of like stance in the sense that we'll make the change more about us and less about the people affected by the change. So it's really important to consider all 4 of these dimensions when we're interacting in the organizational system. Now let's make it real with an example. So let's take a universal problem of, hey, we find out too late that there's problems with the change. Now exploring our elements, you might come to the conclusion that I think these ones make the most sense. So these might be the ideas I can use to help make sense of this dynamic. This is a tool I might be able to use to intervene in the organizational system. I'm going to have to change this about my stance, and I might have to exhibit some courage and grit if this is some change experiment that is radically different from how the organization expects change to happen. So starting from those elements, if I break these down into the 4 dimensions, these are the big ideas that I think make the most sense for this dynamic. So big next now, if we're finding out too late that there's problems, maybe we're planning too far ahead. Maybe we're not focusing on the things that need to be done now and validating those things before moving on to the next set of tasks or change experiments or whatever you want to call them. Could also be that our feedback cycles are too long. So the explore act element gives us a mental model to talk about how if our goal is to learn, so to explore and learn, then maybe we can shorten those feedback cycles instead of just always trying to get to a list of outcomes and tasks. So it's important to get stuff done, but sometimes in change we need to explore the system and kind of noodle around the problem a little bit because our goal might be to learn something, to maybe even figure out what the next set of actions should actually be. So I think that mental model will help me with this. We find out too late in the game that there's problems with the change. Now the third one I picked there, alignment, is, maybe these problems stemmed from a lack of alignment. Maybe we started working on the change before people were aligned. Now that's always going to be the case. You won't ever have everybody aligned in the same way at the same time, but we can work on continuous alignment. So in this example, I've chosen that one because it could be, if we're finding out problems too late, could be some assumptions from a couple of the teams that were working on something that led to, finding out way too late that this isn't exactly what we wanted to do with the change. So next I could move on to tools and practices. All right, well, if we have these problems, we're finding out too late, I think the best thing I can do is create a big visible wall. Maybe that's virtual, maybe that's in person, but I want a single source of truth for the change. I want it somewhere where we can have conversations and hopefully find problems quicker. As soon as we make the invisible work visible, the problems tend to leap out at us. And in this example, I think, this is probably the right thing for us to do right now. Next is stance. So I might have to focus on smaller experiments instead of just executing the plan. So I chose the 5 universals of change, and the yellow dimension you can see on there is valuing experiments over executing the tasks. So again, if we're finding out that there's problems too late, maybe we need to run some type of experiment whereas we immediately flag new projects as red, and then we focus on the 3 things we can do now from the big next now element that will get us closer to green. Now, in order to do that, I have to shift my stance away from being a manager of change to a facilitator of change. And finally, I mentioned that if the approach that I'm taking here with these elements is drastically different from how the organization expects change to happen, one of the 8 properties in the exceptional 8 is courage. So I might have to put my own anxiety aside to a certain degree and step out of my comfort zone to be able to facilitate something a little bit differently to deal with this problem. So that's just a quick example of how I would use the elements of change to try to explore what I could potentially do right now, something I could use to sort of explain the dynamic, what I might want to change about my stance and myself, All total, there's over 130 elements, and you can explore and combine these however you want. Each of these elements have stories, articles, resources, and useful tips, so you can start from one and it will hopefully blossom like a beautiful mind map to help you create a contextualized approach to change. You can find all of those at leanchange.org/approach.